The cold December morning of 1942 brought more than just frost to the RAF Coastal Command airfield in Cornwall. It brought the weight of failure, heavy as the fog rolling in from the Atlantic. Flight Sergeant Thomas Merrick sat in the cramped rear turret of the Wellington bomber, his gloved hands trembling not from cold, but from the statistics that haunted him. 2%. Out of every 100 rounds he fired at enemy aircraft, only 2 found their mark. The squadron leader had been clear during the last briefing: improve or be reassigned to ground duties. For a 23-year-old who had dreamed of defending his country from the skies, it was a sentence worse than death. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories from history to life. Thomas had joined the Royal Air Force in 1940, full of patriotic fervor and romantic notions of aerial combat. Reality had proven brutally different. The rear gunner position, isolated in a perspex bubble at the tail of the aircraft, was statistically the most dangerous job in Bomber Command. The life expectancy was measured in missions, not years. But danger Thomas could handle. What gnawed at him was incompetence. Every sortie over the Bay of Biscay, hunting German U-boats, every encounter with Luftwaffe fighters ended the same way. He would fire frantically, the 4 Browning machine guns thundering in his ears, hot brass casings raining around his boots, and the tracer rounds would arc wide, missing their targets by margins that seemed to mock his efforts. The morning after the squadron leader's warning, Thomas sat alone in the mess hall, nursing weak tea and staring at his hands. They were steady now, but in the air, with adrenaline coursing through his veins and the aircraft bucking in turbulence, they shook like leaves in a gale. Pilot Officer James Hartley, a veteran gunner who had somehow survived 18 months of operations, slid into the seat across from him. "I heard about the ultimatum," Hartley said quietly, his Scottish accent thick as morning porridge. Thomas nodded, unable to meet the older man's eyes. Hartley was a legend in the squadron, credited with 3 confirmed kills and twice as many probable. His survival alone spoke to his skill. "I've tried everything," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I practice the drills. I know the deflection angles. I can strip and reassemble the guns blindfolded, but when we're up there and a Messerschmitt comes screaming out of the sun, I just freeze up and spray rounds everywhere." Hartley leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "That's your problem right there, lad. You're not freezing, you're trying too hard. Let me ask you something. When you're firing, what are you looking at? The enemy plane, obviously." "Wrong. You're looking at where the plane is. I'm asking what you're actually seeing when you aim." Thomas frowned, confused. "I don't understand. Come with me." Hartley led him out to the firing range behind the maintenance hangars. The December wind cut through their flight jackets, carrying the smell of aviation fuel and the distant sound of aircraft engines being tested. Hartley picked up a Lee Enfield rifle from the rangemaster's shack and handed it to Thomas. "See that target at 200 yards? Fire at it. Don't think, just fire." Thomas shouldered the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, missing the target completely. He fired 4 more times with similar results. "Now," Hartley said, taking the rifle, "watch where my eyes go, not where the barrel points. Watch my eyes." Hartley raised the rifle fluidly, and Thomas noticed something remarkable. The older man wasn't staring intently at the target like Thomas had. Instead, his gaze seemed to soften, taking in the target, the wind indicators, the surrounding area all at once. His focus was somehow both relaxed and intensely concentrated. He fired 5 shots in rapid succession. All 5 hit the target, clustered tightly in the center. "You're aiming with tension," Hartley explained, lowering the rifle. "Every muscle in your body is clenched. Your vision tunnels, your breathing stops. You're not a machine, Thomas. You're trying to calculate angles and lead times while your brain is screaming at you that you're about to die. It doesn't work, not in combat. Then what does work? Instinct. But trained instinct. You need to stop aiming and start pointing. Over the next 3 days, Hartley worked with Thomas every spare moment they had. They started with clay pigeons, Hartley tossing them at unpredictable angles while Thomas tracked them with an unloaded shotgun. The key, Hartley insisted, was to let his eyes track the target naturally, while his hands followed without conscious thought. "It's like pointing your finger at something," Hartley explained as they stood in the cold afternoon light, their breath misting in the air. "You don't calculate the angle when you point. Your brain does it automatically, using depth perception and motion tracking that's millions of years old. But the moment you try to aim precisely, you override those instincts with slower, conscious thought. In combat, slow equals dead. The first day was frustrating beyond measure. Thomas had spent months drilling himself on the mathematics of deflection shooting, memorizing tables of angles and distances, calculating lead times based on aircraft speed and range. Now, Hartley was telling him to forget all of it. Every time Thomas raised the shotgun, his mind automatically tried to calculate the trajectory, estimate the clay pigeon's velocity, compute the necessary lead. And every time, he missed. "Stop thinking," Hartley barked after the 20th miss. "Your brain is trying to solve a calculus problem while riding a bicycle. It doesn't work that way. Watch the target. Just watch it. Let your hands worry about where the gun points. But I need to lead it. I need to aim ahead of where it is. No, you need to track it. There's a difference. When you track something moving, your eyes naturally predict where it's going. Your hands will follow that prediction if you let them. The problem is, you're second-guessing your own neurology." Thomas tried again, forcing himself to relax his shoulders, to breathe deeply, despite the cold air burning his lungs. Hartley tossed another clay pigeon, and Thomas watched it arc across the grey December sky. This time, instead of trying to calculate where it would be, he simply followed it with his eyes and let the shotgun move. The action felt wrong, too loose, too imprecise. But when he pulled the trigger, the clay pigeon shattered. "You see?" Hartley's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Your subconscious just did in a fraction of a second what your conscious mind has been failing to do for months. That's what we're going to train. Not your ability to calculate, but your ability to get out of your own way." The afternoon wore on, and gradually Thomas began to understand what Hartley meant. It wasn't that aiming was wrong. It was that in fast-moving combat situations, there wasn't time for the slow, deliberate process of conscious aiming. Instead, he needed to develop what Hartley called situational reflexes, the ability to react to threats with trained instinct rather than calculated responses. "Think about learning to drive," Hartley said during a break, both men warming their hands around mugs of hot tea brought by a sympathetic ground crew member. "When you first started, every action required conscious thought. Press the clutch, move the gear lever, release the clutch while pressing the accelerator. It was exhausting, yeah, but now, after months of practice, you don't think about it anymore. Your hands and feet just do it. That's what we're building. Combat reflexes that bypass conscious thought." The second day brought new challenges. Hartley had arranged for a truck to drive across the airfield while towing a target on a long pole. Thomas stood in a mock-up turret, tracking the moving target with a camera gun that recorded where he was aiming. The first runs were disasters. Thomas's tracking was jerky, his aiming erratic. The film showed his point of aim jumping around wildly, never settling on the target for more than a fraction of a second. "You're chasing," Hartley diagnosed after reviewing the footage. "You see where the target is, you swing to catch up, but by the time you get there it's moved again, so you chase it some more. Classic mistake. You're always behind, always reacting instead of anticipating. How do I anticipate? You don't, not consciously. But your eyes do it automatically if you let them. Watch this." Hartley climbed into the mock turret and tracked the target through several runs. When they reviewed his footage, the difference was stark. Hartley's point of aim stayed consistently ahead of the target, moving smoothly rather than jerking. He wasn't chasing. He was leading naturally, his eyes predicting the target's path and his hands maintaining that prediction without conscious adjustment. Thomas tried to analyze what Hartley was doing differently, to break it down into steps he could replicate. But that was exactly the wrong approach, and Hartley told him so bluntly, "Stop analyzing. Stop trying to understand it intellectually. Just do it. Watch the target and let your body respond. Trust that millions of years of evolution have given you the ability to track moving objects. You're a predator, Thomas. Your ancestors hunted game by tracking movement and throwing spears. That ability is still in you. You just need to stop interfering with it." The words struck something deep in Thomas. He climbed back into the mock turret and waited for the truck to make another run. This time, he didn't try to think about what he was doing. He simply watched the target and let his hands move the turret controls. The motion felt smooth, natural, almost effortless. When they reviewed the footage, Hartley actually smiled. "That's it. That's exactly it. You're not chasing anymore. You're tracking. Now we need to make that automatic so you can do it under stress." The third day was about adding pressure. Hartley had Thomas track targets while standing on one foot, while holding his breath, while another instructor shouted in his ear. The goal was to maintain the smooth tracking under conditions that simulated combat stress. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. But gradually, Thomas found he could maintain the relaxed focus even when his heart was racing and his muscles were tense with effort. "The key is separating the stress from the skill," Hartley explained. "Your body can be afraid, your heart can race, your mouth can be dry. That's all normal and unavoidable in combat. But the skill, the actual tracking and firing, that has to stay smooth. It has to be independent of the fear. That's what we're training. The ability to perform the necessary actions regardless of what your emotional state is." By the evening of the third day, Thomas was exhausted, but something fundamental had changed. He could feel it in how his body responded to moving targets. The jerky, chasing motion was gone, replaced by smooth tracking that felt almost instinctive. Hartley seemed satisfied, though he cautioned that the real test would come under actual combat conditions. "Tomorrow we go up," Hartley said, as they walked back to the barracks through the gathering darkness. "You'll track a drogue target being towed by another aircraft. That's as close to combat conditions as we can get in training. If you can hit that consistently, you'll know the change is real." That night, Thomas lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base settling into evening routine. Distant aircraft engines being run up for testing. The murmur of voices from the mess hall, the ever-present wind whistling through gaps in the barracks walls. He thought about the past 3 days, about everything Hartley had taught him. It seemed almost too simple. Stop trying so hard. Trust your instincts. Let your body do what it already knows how to do. But simple wasn't the same as easy. Breaking the habits of months of training, of consciously calculating every shot, required more than just understanding the concept. It required rewiring his responses at a fundamental level, and he wouldn't know if that rewiring had truly taken hold until he faced a real threat with live ammunition and his life on the line. The breakthrough came on the third day. Hartley had rigged up a pulley system with a target that swung erratically across their field of vision. Thomas had been firing at it for an hour with no success, his frustration mounting with each miss. Finally, exhausted and angry, he stopped trying to aim carefully. He simply looked at the target and let his body react. The clay pigeon exploded into fragments, then another and another. Something had clicked. It wasn't magic or supernatural intuition. It was his visual cortex and motor control system finally working together without interference from his conscious mind. The same way a person could catch a ball thrown at them without calculating trajectories, Thomas was learning to track and fire at moving targets using evolved human capabilities that predated mathematics. "That's it," Hartley said, excitement evident in his usually stoic voice. "That's exactly it. Now we need to transfer this to the air." The following morning they went up in a training flight. The rear turret of the Wellington was cramped and cold, the perspex scratched from countless missions, offering a panoramic view of empty sky and distant clouds. Hartley had arranged for a Spitfire from a nearby fighter squadron to conduct mock attacks on their bomber. As the fighter came screaming in from 5 o'clock high, Thomas felt the familiar surge of panic. But instead of tensing up, he forced himself to breathe slowly, softened his focus, and simply tracked the incoming aircraft with his eyes. His hands followed naturally, the turret rotating smoothly, the gun barrels elevating. When the Spitfire crossed into his field of fire, he pressed the triggers. The gun camera footage reviewed later that day showed something remarkable. Thomas had led the target perfectly, his tracer rounds converging exactly where the Spitfire would have been. The armourer who reviewed the footage whistled low. "If those had been live rounds, you'd have shredded him." "What happened to you, Merrick? Find religion or something?" Thomas shook his head, still processing the change himself. It wasn't divine intervention. It was removing the interference between perception and action. He had been overthinking, trying to consciously control what his subconscious was already capable of doing naturally. "Just had a good teacher," he replied. The real test came 2 weeks later during a patrol over the Bay of Biscay. The Wellington was hunting U-boats in the grey December waters when the warning came over the intercom. The pilot's voice was tight with tension. "Bandits at 6 o'clock high. 2 of them, Focke-Wulf 190s. Thomas rotated his turret to face the threat, his heart hammering but his hands steady. The 2 German fighters came diving out of the overcast, their cannons already flickering. He could see the muzzle flashes bright as lightning. Tracer rounds streaked past the bomber, one line passing so close he could feel the heat through the perspex. Instead of panic firing, as he would have done a month earlier, Thomas waited. He tracked the lead fighter with soft focus, letting his eyes and hands work together. The Focke-Wulf grew larger in his sight picture, its distinctive radial engine and squared wingtips clearly visible. The German pilot was coming in fast and straight, confident that the British gunner would miss, as they usually did. Thomas pressed his triggers. The 4 Brownings roared to life, their combined fire rate spitting out nearly 5,000 rounds per minute. He walked his tracer stream across the fighter's approach path, leading it by what felt right rather than what calculations said. The German pilot saw the danger too late. He tried to break left, but flew directly into Thomas's stream of fire. The effect was instantaneous and devastating, tracer rounds stitched across the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling and cockpit. Pieces of metal tore away, spinning into the slipstream. Black smoke erupted from the engine, and the fighter's nose dropped sharply. Thomas didn't have time to watch it fall. The second fighter was already adjusting its attack angle, more cautious now. This pilot was smarter, weaving slightly as he closed, but Thomas had entered a state of pure reaction. He wasn't thinking about lead angles or deflection anymore. He was simply tracking and firing, his body responding to the threat with trained instinct. His tracer rounds followed the fighter's weave, anticipating rather than chasing. The German pilot broke off his attack after taking hits to his wing route, rolling away and fleeing south toward France. The intercom exploded with voices. The pilot was shouting something about brilliant shooting. The navigator was trying to get a position fix on the downed fighter for their report. But Thomas barely heard them. He was breathing hard, adrenaline still singing in his veins, but there was a calmness underneath it. He had done what he trained to do. No more, no less. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting him as the immediate danger passed. He rotated the turret slowly, scanning for more threats, but the sky was empty except for scattered clouds and the distant smudge of smoke where the Focke-Wulf had gone down. Thomas realized with a start that he had just killed another human being. The abstract concept of air combat had suddenly become horrifyingly concrete. There had been a man in that cockpit, someone's son, perhaps someone's father or husband. And now that man was dead, falling into the grey December waters of the Bay of Biscay. The flight back to base took 90 minutes, and every minute of it Thomas wrestled with what he had done. The elation of success was there, he couldn't deny it. He had protected his crew, had done his job effectively for the first time, but underneath that was something darker. He kept seeing the moment when his tracer rounds tore into the fighter's cockpit, imagining what it must have been like for the German pilot in those final seconds. When they landed, Thomas's legs nearly buckled as he climbed out of the turret. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, despite the bitter cold at altitude. The ground crew gathered around, wanting to hear the story, to congratulate him. But Thomas felt disconnected from their enthusiasm, as if he were watching the scene from a great distance. The squadron leader called him into the operations room for the debriefing. The gun camera footage was played and replayed, analyzed frame by frame. The intelligence officer asked detailed questions about the enemy aircraft, their tactics, their behavior. Thomas answered mechanically, describing what he had seen without mentioning what he felt. After the debriefing, he found himself alone in the armory, methodically cleaning his guns, even though the ground crew had already done so. The repetitive motion was soothing, requiring just enough attention to keep darker thoughts at bay. He was disassembling the second Browning when Hartley found him. The older gunner didn't say anything at first, just pulled up a stool and began helping with the cleaning. They worked in silence for several minutes before Hartley spoke. First kill is always the hardest, not the shooting itself, that's just mechanics. It's what comes after, the realization that you just ended someone's existence. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. You did everything right up there, Hartley continued. Clean shooting, no wasted ammunition, protected your crew. That's what matters, that's what you need to remember, but he was just doing his job too. That German pilot. He was probably just like me, following orders, trying to survive. Probably. Was full of young men just trying to survive. But here's the thing, Thomas. He chose to attack your aircraft. He chose to try to kill you and your crew. You didn't seek him out. You defended yourself and your mates. There's a moral difference there, even if it doesn't make it easier. Thomas continued working on the gun, his hands moving with practiced precision. Does it get easier? No, it gets different. You learn to live with it, to carry it. But it never becomes easy, not if you're a decent human being. The day it becomes easy is the day you need to worry about yourself. The conversation helped, though it didn't erase the weight Thomas felt. Over the following days, as word of his success spread through the squadron, he found himself uncomfortable with the attention. Other gunners wanted tips, wanted to know his secret. Officers nodded approvingly when they passed him, but Thomas felt like a fraud. He hadn't discovered some magical technique. He had simply learned to stop interfering with his own abilities, and in doing so had become effective at killing. The nightmares started about a week later, always the same dream. The Focke-Wulf coming in, growing larger in his sight picture, but instead of just seeing the aircraft, he could see the pilot's face through the canopy. A young man, no older than himself, with terror in his eyes as the tracer rounds approached. Thomas would wake gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, the image burning in his mind. He mentioned the dreams to Hartley during one of their walks around the perimeter. The Scottish gunner listened without judgment, then shared his own experiences. I still see them sometimes, the faces I imagine for the men I've killed. 3 confirmed, maybe 5 more probables. That's 8 men, possibly, who aren't going home because of me. I carry that. We all do. those of us with any conscience. How do you keep flying, keep fighting? Because the alternative is worse. If I quit, if you quit, then less skilled gunners take our places. More of our crews die. More bombers get shot down, meaning the war lasts longer, meaning more death overall. We're caught in a system we didn't create, Thomas. The best we can do is try to minimize the damage, protect who we can, and hope it ends soon. The philosophy was pragmatic rather than comforting, but it helped Thomas frame his role in a way he could live with. He wasn't a killer seeking glory. He was a defender doing a necessary job in terrible circumstances. The distinction mattered to him. The squadron leader was waiting on the tarmac when they landed. The gun camera footage had been radioed ahead, and the news had spread through the base like wildfire. The gunner who couldn't hit anything had just downed a Focke-Wulf and damaged another. As Thomas climbed stiffly out of the aircraft, his legs cramped from hours in the cramped turret, the squadron leader approached with an expression that might have been respect. "Well, Merrick, seems you found your touch. What changed?" Thomas thought about how to explain it. "How do you tell someone that you learned to stop trying so hard? That the secret was getting out of your own way?" "I stopped aiming and started seeing, sir. Pilot Officer Hartley showed me how." The squadron leader glanced at Hartley, who was standing nearby with his characteristic understated manner. The older gunner gave a slight nod. "Good man, Hartley. We need more gunners like you too. Merrick, you're not only off probation, I'm recommending you for an air gunner instructor posting. We need to spread whatever you learned to the rest of the command." Over the next 6 months, Thomas flew another 23 combat missions. His hit rate stabilized at just over 60%, a phenomenal improvement that made him one of the most effective gunners in Coastal Command. He was credited with 3 confirmed kills and 5 probables, statistics that told only part of the story. More importantly, he survived, and he helped others survive by keeping enemy fighters at bay. But the transformation had cost him something. The first man he killed stayed with him. In quieter moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Thomas would think about the Focke-Wulf pilot, some German boy not much different from himself, with parents and perhaps a sweetheart waiting for him to come home. War demanded he not think about such things, but Thomas found he couldn't stop. The skill that saved his life and the lives of his crew had ended others. There was no escaping that truth. Hartley, in his pragmatic Scottish way, addressed it one evening as they shared a cigarette outside the mess hall. The stars were brilliant above them, unobscured by the blackout, since they were far from any city. The sound of the sea was constant, rhythmic, indifferent to human conflict. "You're thinking about the ones you hit," Hartley observed. It wasn't a question. "Is it always like this? Wondering about them?" For anyone with a conscience, yes. The trick is not letting it paralyze you. You didn't start this war, Thomas. You're not the reason that pilot died. Hitler and his lot are. You just refuse to be a victim of their aggression. Remember that. Thomas drew deeply on his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the darkness. How do you live with it? By living, by making it count for something. Every mission you survive, every crew you bring home, that's a victory against the waste and stupidity of this whole bloody mess. And by teaching others what you know, you're going to that instructor posting. You'll teach dozens, maybe hundreds of gunners what you learned. Some of them will survive because of you. That matters. The instructor posting came through in June of 1943. Thomas was reassigned to an aircrew training facility in northern England, where fresh-faced recruits arrived weekly, most of them barely out of their teens. He recognized himself in their eyes, the mixture of excitement and fear, the naive belief that training alone would keep them alive. Teaching proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The technical aspects were straightforward. Loading procedures, gun maintenance, recognition of enemy aircraft types, all of this could be taught through repetition and testing. But the crucial element, the relaxed awareness that had transformed his own shooting, was maddeningly difficult to communicate. He tried demonstrating it, taking students to the range and showing them the difference between tense aiming and natural pointing. Some got it immediately, their hit rates jumping as his had. Others struggled, too locked into the idea that precision required conscious control. Thomas developed drills and exercises, refining Hartley's teaching methods through trial and error. The first major challenge came with a student named Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Hong Kong before the war. Chen was technically brilliant, scoring perfectly on written exams and demonstrating flawless knowledge of aircraft recognition and ballistics theory. But on the range, he couldn't hit anything. His scores were even worse than Thomas's had been. Thomas watched Chen during a practice session, noting how the young man's entire body tensed when he took aim, how his breathing stopped, how his face contorted with concentration. After the session, Thomas called him aside. "Chen, you're thinking too much. I can see it. You're trying to calculate everything consciously. But Sergeant, that's what all the manuals say. Calculate deflection angle, estimate range, account for wind and slipstream. The manuals are written by people who've never been shot at. In combat, there's no time for calculations. You need to react instinctively. But instinct isn't reliable. It's just guessing." Thomas realized he needed a different approach with Chen. The young man's analytical mind was actually working against him, so Thomas tried an experiment. He took Chen to the base gymnasium and handed him a basketball. "Throw this into that basket," Thomas instructed, pointing to a hoop at the far end of the gym. Chen looked confused but complied. He held the ball, visibly calculating trajectory and force, then threw. The ball fell short by several feet. "Now stop thinking and just throw it. But I need to calculate the proper arc and velocity." "No, you don't. Your brain can do it automatically if you let it. Just look at the basket and throw." Reluctantly, Chen tried again. This time, instead of the long pause for calculation, he simply looked at the basket and threw. The ball swished through the net. Chen stared in amazement. "How did I do that?" "Your visual cortex and motor control system work together. Millions of years of evolution have optimized humans for throwing things at targets. You just need to trust that system instead of overriding it with conscious thought." The lesson clicked for Chen. Over the next week, his shooting scores climbed from abysmal to respectable. He would never be the highest-scoring gunner. His analytical mind wouldn't allow him to fully let go, but he became competent enough to survive. Then there was David Morrison, a cocky 19-year-old from Liverpool who thought he already knew everything. Morrison had grown up hunting with his father and considered himself an expert marksman. His scores on stationary targets were indeed excellent. But on moving targets, he struggled just as badly as everyone else. The problem with Morrison was attitude. He resented being taught by someone only a few years older than himself, especially when the lesson seemed to contradict his years of shooting experience. After a particularly frustrating session where Morrison had loudly insisted his method was better, Thomas took him aside. "Morrison, you're a good shot. No one's disputing that. But shooting at a rabbit or a pheasant is different from shooting at an aircraft, moving at 300 miles per hour, while someone's shooting back at you. I've been shooting since I was 10 years old. I know how to lead a moving target. Then why are you missing?" The question hung in the air. Morrison's face reddened, but he had no answer. Thomas pressed his advantage. "Your problem isn't skill, it's arrogance. You think you already know everything, so you're not really trying to learn. Every gunner I've seen with that attitude either washes out of training or gets killed in combat. Which one do you want to be?" The harsh words got through where gentle instruction hadn't. Morrison started actually listening, actually trying the techniques Thomas taught. His progress was rapid once his ego got out of the way. Within 2 weeks, he was one of the top scorers in the class. Thomas made him an assistant instructor, figuring that teaching others would cement the lessons. But not every student could be reached. Samuel Briggs was 27, older than most recruits, with a wife and 2 children back in Manchester. The pressure of knowing his family depended on his survival was crushing him. Every time Briggs picked up a weapon, his hands shook. Every practice session ended with him missing wildly, his fear overriding any technique Thomas tried to teach. Thomas spent hours with Briggs, trying different approaches, relaxation exercises, visualization techniques, gradual exposure to increase his comfort with weapons. Nothing worked. The man's fear was simply too profound. After 3 weeks, Thomas had to make the hardest decision of his instructorship. He recommended Briggs for reassignment to ground duties. The meeting with Briggs was painful. The older man broke down, crying about letting his family down, about being a coward. Thomas found himself in the unfamiliar role of counselor. "You're not a coward. You volunteered, knowing the risks. But not everyone is suited for combat roles, and that's not a moral failing. Ground crew are essential to keeping aircraft flying. You can serve honorably in that role and still go home to your family. But I wanted to fight. I wanted to do my part. You are doing your part, just in a different way than you expected. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations. The real cowardice would be lying about your abilities and getting your entire crew killed because you can't perform under pressure." Briggs eventually accepted the reassignment, though Thomas knew the man would carry the disappointment forever. It was a reminder that not everyone could be trained for combat, no matter how good the instruction. Some people simply didn't have the psychological makeup for violence. As the months passed, Thomas developed a reputation as the instructor who could fix broken shooters. Gunners who had washed out of other training programs were sent to him for a last chance. Most of them had the same fundamental problem Thomas had once faced. They were overthinking, trying to control consciously what should be handled instinctively. He refined his teaching methods, creating a progression that worked for most students. First, build confidence with stationary targets. Then introduce slow-moving targets, gradually increasing speed. Teach relaxation techniques to manage stress. Use visualization to prepare for combat scenarios. And always emphasize the principle of natural tracking over conscious aiming. The success rate was remarkable. Of the gunners Thomas trained, nearly 70% achieved acceptable combat proficiency compared to the 50% average for other instructors. The difference was significant enough that senior officers took notice. Thomas was asked to write up his methods for potential inclusion in official training doctrine. He worked on the manual for months, trying to capture in words the intuitive understanding that Hartley had given him. It was challenging to describe something that was fundamentally about not thinking, about trusting unconscious processes. But gradually, with input from Hartley and other experienced gunners, a comprehensive training program emerged. The manual emphasized psychological preparation as much as technical skill. It included sections on managing fear, maintaining focus under stress, and developing the relaxed awareness necessary for instinctive shooting. It challenged the prevailing orthodoxy that precision required rigid, conscious control, instead arguing for trained instinct and natural tracking. When the manual was submitted to command for review, it generated controversy. Some senior officers, particularly those who had never flown combat missions, insisted that the approach was too informal, too reliant on instinct rather than discipline. But combat veterans recognized its value immediately. They had seen the difference between gunners who could only shoot well on the range and those who could perform under fire. The debate was settled by results. Squadrons that adopted Thomas's training methods showed measurably better survival rates and combat effectiveness. The statistics were undeniable, and the manual was officially adopted as supplementary training doctrine in early 1944. One student, A quiet farm boy from Yorkshire named Peter Walsh seemed completely hopeless. His scores were abysmal, his shooting erratic. After a particularly frustrating session, Thomas sat down with him in the empty classroom, the smell of chalk dust and gun oil hanging in the air. "Walsh, level with me. What's going through your head when you're on the guns?" The young man's face reddened. "I keep thinking I'm going to let everyone down, Sergeant, that I'll freeze when it matters and get my whole crew killed." Thomas recognized the fear. He had felt it himself, that crushing weight of responsibility. "So you're not really shooting at the target. You're shooting at your own fear." Walsh nodded miserably. "How do I stop?" "You don't stop the fear. You acknowledge it and set it aside. Look, every man up there is scared. The ones who survive aren't braver, they're just better at functioning despite the fear. And functioning means trusting your training and your instincts. Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we're going up in an aircraft. Not a trainer on the ground, a real Wellington. And you're going to fire at a drogue target. But before you do, I want you to accept something. You're probably going to miss. Your first magazine, maybe your second, you'll miss. That's fine, expected even. What matters is what you do next." Walsh looked doubtful but nodded. Thomas spent the evening thinking about how to reach the young man. Fear was natural, rational even, but paralyzing fear. The kind that prevented effective action, that had to be managed. He remembered his own journey, how Hartley had broken through his overthinking with patience and practical demonstration. The next day dawned clear and cold, unusual for northern England. They flew out over the North Sea, the coastline falling away behind them as the Wellington climbed to altitude. The target aircraft, an older Blenheim bomber, towed a drogue, a sleeve-shaped target on a long cable. Walsh settled into the rear turret, his face pale but determined. "Just track it," Thomas instructed over the intercom. "Don't try to hit it yet, just watch it move and let your turret follow it naturally." For 5 minutes, Walsh simply tracked the drogue as it bobbed and weaved in the slipstream. Thomas watched from behind him, noting how the young gunner's shoulders gradually relaxed, how his tracking became smoother. The key was removing the pressure of success, allowing Walsh to simply experience the motion without the stress of trying to hit anything. Now, fire a short burst, still not trying to hit it, just feeling the guns. Walsh pressed his triggers. The Brownings hammered briefly, tracer rounds arcing out and falling below the target. But something in the boy's posture had changed. He wasn't tensing up anymore. The act of firing without the expectation of hitting had broken the cycle of anxiety and failure. Good. Now forget about everything except keeping the drogue in your sight picture. Don't chase it with the rounds. Just keep your eyes on it and fire when it feels right. The next burst was closer, then closer still. On his 5th attempt, Walsh's tracer stream intersected the drogue, tearing fabric. Over the intercom, Thomas heard the boy's shout of triumph, quickly followed by embarrassed silence. "That's it," Thomas said, unable to keep the grin from his voice. "Now do it again." Walsh did, and again and again. By the time they landed, he had hit the drogue 17 times out of 30 attempts, more than 50%. The transformation in his confidence was visible. He climbed out of the aircraft, standing straighter, his eyes brighter. The change in Walsh rippled through the training squadron. If the most hopeless student could be turned around, then anyone could learn. Other struggling students approached Thomas with renewed hope. His methods, once viewed skeptically by some, were now sought after eagerly. But Thomas never forgot that each student was different, requiring individual attention and customized approaches. Walsh had needed permission to fail. Morrison had needed his ego checked. Chen had needed a different conceptual framework. Briggs had needed honest recognition that combat wasn't for him. The art of instruction, Thomas realized, was as much about understanding people as it was about teaching techniques. He began keeping detailed notes on each student, tracking not just their scores, but their personalities, their fears, their motivations. he developed a taxonomy of common problems and effective solutions. Students who overthought needed exercises that bypassed conscious analysis. Students who lacked confidence needed gradual success building. Students whose egos interfered needed humbling experiences followed by genuine achievement. One of his most challenging students was Henry Patterson, a former accountant from London who approached everything with methodical precision. Patterson kept a notebook filled with calculations, tables of deflection angles, formulas for lead times based on various speeds and ranges. His theoretical knowledge was impeccable. His practical shooting was terrible. Thomas tried the usual approaches, demonstrating natural tracking, having Patterson practice without conscious thought. Nothing worked. Patterson's analytical mind simply couldn't let go of the calculations. Every time he went to shoot, Thomas could see him mentally consulting his tables, trying to match the situation to a formula. Finally, Thomas tried something radical. He had Patterson spend an entire day on the range with a gun that had deliberately misaligned sights. Every shot would miss by a consistent margin. At first, Patterson was frustrated, checking his calculations obsessively, unable to understand why his perfect math wasn't working. But after several hours, something shifted. Unable to rely on his formulas because they consistently produced wrong results, Patterson began making intuitive adjustments. He started actually watching where his shots went and correcting by feel rather than calculation. By the end of the day, despite the misaligned sights, he was hitting targets consistently through pure instinctive compensation. The next day, Thomas gave him a properly sighted gun without telling him about the switch. Patterson's scores jumped immediately. His analytical mind had finally learned to work with his intuition rather than overriding it. He would never be as fluid as natural shooters like Morrison, but he became adequately competent for combat. By the time they landed, Walsh had hit the drogue 17 times out of 30 attempts, more than 50%. The transformation in his confidence was visible. He climbed out of the aircraft standing straighter, his eyes brighter. Word spread through the training squadron. Merrick had done it again, turned another hopeless shot into a gunner who might actually survive. As the war progressed, Thomas tracked the fates of his students as best he could through the informal networks of the RAF. Some were killed, their names appearing on casualty lists that grew longer each month. But others survived, and occasionally he would receive a letter thanking him for the training that had kept them alive. One student, now flying operations over Germany, wrote that he had downed 2 night fighters using the techniques Thomas had taught. Another wrote from a hospital bed, recovering from wounds, but alive because he had been able to fight back effectively when his bomber was attacked. These letters sustained Thomas through the darker moments of the war. Each one represented a life saved, a family that would remain whole, a future that wouldn't be cut short. He kept them in a box under his bunk, rereading them when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. One letter stood out particularly. It came from Robert Chen, the analytical student who had struggled so badly with overthinking. Chen wrote from a hospital in southern England, where he was recovering from frostbite suffered during a mission over Berlin. His bomber had been attacked by 3 fighters simultaneously, and Chen had managed to damage 2 of them severely enough to break off the attack. The pilot credited Chen with saving the entire crew. Reading that letter, Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in Chen's success, relief that his training had made a difference, but also the sobering awareness that Chen's success meant German pilots had likely died or been wounded. The moral complexity of his role never quite resolved itself. He was teaching young men to kill effectively, even if the purpose was defensive. Lives saved on one side meant lives lost on the other. Another letter came from David Morrison, the cocky Liverpudlian whose attitude had needed adjustment. Morrison had become one of the most decorated gunners in Bomber Command, credited with 5 confirmed kills. But his letter wasn't boastful. Instead, it was reflective, almost melancholy. "You taught me more than shooting," Morrison wrote. "You taught me that confidence without skill is dangerous, and that real competence comes from knowing your limitations as well as your strengths. I've stayed alive this long not because I'm the best shot, though I'm decent enough, but because I remember what you said about arrogance getting people killed. I check my ego at the aircraft door every mission. My crew relies on me for clear judgment as much as accurate fire." The letter revealed a maturity that the 19-year-old Morrison had lacked in training. War had completed his education in ways Thomas's instruction never could. Combat had a way of burning away youthful arrogance, leaving either wisdom or trauma in its place. Morrison seemed to have emerged with the former, though Thomas suspected trauma lurked beneath the surface as well. Not all the correspondence was positive. In April 1944, Thomas received a letter from the parents of Samuel Harris, a student who had completed training just 2 months earlier. Harris had been killed on his 4th combat mission when his bomber was shot down over France. The parents wanted to know if their son had been properly prepared, if he'd had a fair chance of survival. Thomas spent hours composing his response. He couldn't lie and say Harris had been an exceptional student. The young man had been adequate, capable but not outstanding, but he had completed the training and been certified combat ready. What killed Harris wasn't lack of training, but the simple, brutal mathematics of bomber operations. Even the best-trained gunners died when a fighter's cannon rounds hit the right spot or when flak tore through the aircraft's vitals. "Your son was well-trained and competent," Thomas wrote, choosing his words carefully. He had mastered the skills necessary for his role. "But I would be dishonest if I told you that training alone guarantees survival in combat. There is always an element of chance, of being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Samuel did everything he was supposed to do. Sometimes that isn't enough, and that's not a failure on his part or anyone's. It's simply the terrible reality of war." The letter was one of the hardest things Thomas ever wrote. He knew it would provide little comfort to grieving parents, but he felt they deserved honesty rather than platitudes. The response he received weeks later thanked him for his candor and expressed pride that their son had served honorably, even if briefly. As 1944 progressed and the Allied invasion of Europe approached, the pace of training intensified. Thomas's classes swelled with new recruits. Young men rushed through training to replace the mounting casualties. The quality of instruction inevitably suffered when quantity became the priority, but Thomas did his best to maintain standards. Every poorly trained gunner sent into combat was a life at risk, multiplied by the 6 or 7 other crew members depending on him. He developed shorter, more intensive versions of his training program, concentrating on the essential skills that made the biggest difference in survival. Advanced techniques were sacrificed in favor of core competencies. It wasn't ideal, but it was pragmatic. A gunner who could track and fire instinctively had better survival odds than one who knew advanced ballistics but couldn't hit a target under stress. The invasion of Normandy in June brought a surge of optimism tempered by continued heavy casualties. The air war intensified as Allied bombers supported ground operations and struck deeper into Germany. Thomas's students were dying in greater numbers, but they were also surviving in greater numbers than students from other training programs. The statistics, cold and impersonal, showed that his methods made a measurable difference. In August, Thomas received a letter from Peter Walsh, the farm boy from Yorkshire, who had seemed so hopeless. Walsh had completed 30 combat missions, enough to earn rotation back to training duties. He was being assigned as an assistant instructor at Thomas's facility. The reunion was emotional for both men. Walsh had left as a frightened boy, barely capable of hitting a stationary target. He returned as a veteran with the Distinguished Flying Medal and a maturity that came from surviving 6 months of nightly missions over Germany. They shared a drink in the mess, and Walsh talked about his experiences. "The techniques you taught me kept me alive," Walsh said, his Yorkshire accent thicker after time away from the training base. "There were a dozen times when fighters came at us, and I had to react instantly. No time to think, no time to calculate, just track and fire the way you taught. I damaged enough of them to make them break off attacks. That's all we needed, not to shoot them down necessarily, just make them cautious enough to leave us alone." Thomas asked about the psychological toll, and Walsh's expression darkened. "That's harder to talk about. I know I killed at least 2 pilots, probably more. They were trying to kill me first, so it's not like I had a choice. But I still see their aircraft going down sometimes when I close my eyes. It doesn't haunt me exactly, but it's there. Part of who I am now." The conversation reminded Thomas why he had transitioned from combat to training. He could make a bigger difference teaching hundreds than flying dozens of missions, and if he was honest with himself, he wasn't certain he could maintain the psychological resilience necessary for sustained combat operations. Training was hard enough. Carrying the weight of knowing some students wouldn't survive, actually being in combat, actually killing repeatedly, that might break something essential in him. With Walsh's addition to the instructional staff, Thomas was able to refine his program further. Having a recent combat veteran to provide first-hand accounts added credibility to the training. Students listened differently when Walsh described actual encounters with enemy fighters, the split-second decisions that meant survival or death. Theory became concrete reality in a way Thomas's instruction alone couldn't achieve. The war dragged on through late 1944 and into early 1945. Germany's defeat seemed inevitable, but the fighting remained fierce. Thomas continued training gunners, watching young men arrive full of nervous energy and leave with the skills and confidence to defend their aircraft. Some would survive, some would die. All he could do was give them the best possible preparation. These letters sustained Thomas through the darker moments of the war. By late 1944, the tide had clearly turned against Germany, but the fighting remained brutal. The Luftwaffe, though depleted, still had skilled and determined pilots. Every bomber that went out faced the possibility of not returning. Every gunner Thomas trained might be dead within weeks of completing the course. Hartley visited the training facility in September of that year. He had been promoted to flying officer and wore the ribbon of the Distinguished Flying Medal on his chest. The two men walked along the perimeter fence of the airfield, watching students practice on the gunnery range, the staccato bark of machine gun fire constant in the autumn air. "How many do you think you've trained now?" Hartley asked. Thomas considered. "Nearly 400 have gone through my courses. Maybe half of them really got what we were teaching. The others, they learned the mechanics but not the mindset. That's still 200 gunners who have a better chance than they would have otherwise. You should be proud of that." "I am, mostly. But I also know that some of them are dead now. I taught them how to kill more effectively and they still died." Hartley stopped walking and faced him. "Thomas, listen to me. This war isn't about killing. Not really. It's about surviving until the killing can stop. Every gunner you train who makes it through because of what you taught them, that's a life saved. Maybe he saves his whole crew by keeping fighters at bay. That's 7 more lives. Those men go home, have families, live the lives they were meant to live. That matters. Don't lose sight of that." The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Thomas was still at the training facility when news of Germany's surrender came through. The celebration was muted, tinged with exhaustion and the knowledge of how much had been lost. Of the 400 gunners Thomas had trained, 97 had been killed in action. 203 had survived the war. The fate of the rest was unknown, lost in the chaos of the final months. Thomas remained in the RAF after the war, continuing to teach air gunnery even as the service downsized and transitioned to peacetime operations. The techniques he and Hartley had developed were codified into official training doctrine, spreading throughout Bomber Command and eventually to other Allied air forces. The concept of natural pointing rather than conscious aiming, of training instinct rather than just mechanics, became standard. In 1947, Thomas was awarded the Air Force Cross for his contributions to air gunnery training. The citation mentioned the lives saved through improved gunner effectiveness, though it couldn't quantify the number. How do you count the bomber crews that made it home because their gunner had been taught to shoot effectively? How do you measure the families that weren't destroyed because a father or son survived? Hartley attended the ceremony, now a squadron leader with a chest full of medals. Afterward, over drinks in a London pub, the older man raised his glass in a toast to stopping trying and starting seeing. Thomas clinked his glass against Hartley's, to getting out of our own way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who had survived a war that had killed so many of their friends and students. The pub was full of civilians, people who had lived through the Blitz and the rationing, but who hadn't flown missions over hostile territory or fought in the cramped confines of a bomber turret. "Do you think it matters?" Thomas asked quietly. "What we did, teaching people to kill more efficiently." Hartley took a long drink before answering. "We taught people to defend themselves and their crews. The killing was incidental to the survival. And yes, it matters. Every man who came home because he could fight back. Every crew that landed safely because their gunner kept the fighters away. That mattered to them and their families. We didn't start the war, Thomas. We just helped people survive it." In the years that followed, Thomas would occasionally encounter his former students. Some had stayed in the RAF, making it a career. Others had returned to civilian life, becoming shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers. One became a commercial airline pilot. Another opened a pub in Manchester. They all remembered the day something clicked, when shooting stopped being an impossible puzzle and became an instinctive skill. The story of Thomas Merrick's transformation from the worst gunner in his squadron to one of the most effective, and his subsequent impact as an instructor, became something of a legend in RAF circles. But for Thomas himself, the real story was simpler and more personal. It was about recognizing that sometimes the obstacle to success is our own interference with natural ability. It was about learning that precision and control aren't always the same thing. And most importantly, it was about the human capacity to adapt and improve, even under the most desperate circumstances. He retired from the RAF in 1955 as a flight lieutenant, having trained over 1,000 air gunners throughout his career. His students had served in conflicts around the world, from the Cold War tensions over Berlin to the Korean War. The techniques he had learned from Hartley and refined through teaching had become foundational to air gunnery training in multiple air forces. In his final year of service, Thomas wrote a training manual that codified everything he had learned. It emphasized the psychological aspects of combat shooting, the importance of managing fear and stress, the techniques for developing natural instinctive fire rather than relying on conscious calculation. The manual remained in use for decades, long after jet aircraft had replaced the bombers and fighters of World War II. Thomas Merrick passed away in 1992 at the age of 73. His obituary in the RAF Association newsletter mentioned his wartime service and his contributions to air gunnery training, but the words couldn't capture the full impact of what he had done. Somewhere in England, in a dozen other countries, old men who had been young gunners in his classes remembered the day they learned to stop aiming and start seeing. Some of them were alive because of that lesson. Their children and grandchildren existed because Thomas Merrick had been a bad shot who learned to be good, and who then taught others how to make the same transformation. The change from 2% accuracy to 60% hadn't been magic. It had been the removal of interference, the cultivation of instinct, The recognition that sometimes the human mind performs best when it stops trying so hard to perform. It was a lesson that applied far beyond air gunnery, touching on fundamental truths about learning, performance, and the relationship between conscious thought and unconscious competence. In a box of his effects kept by his daughter, there was a faded photograph of Thomas and Hartley standing beside a Wellington bomber in 1943. Both men were young, their faces unlined despite the stress of war. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's handwriting, was a simple inscription, "The day I learned to see." That photograph and the lessons it represented outlived both men. In military academies and training facilities, instructors still teach the principles that Hartley showed Thomas and that Thomas passed on to hundreds of others. The specific context has changed. Modern weapons and aircraft are vastly different from those of World War II, but the fundamental truth remains. Sometimes the path to excellence lies not in trying harder, but in learning to trust the capabilities we already possess, in removing the obstacles we create for ourselves, in seeing clearly rather than forcing precision. Thomas Merrick entered the war as a young man full of patriotic fervor and romantic notions. He nearly washed out as a gunner because he couldn't hit anything. Through the patient teaching of a Scottish veteran and his own determination to improve, he transformed himself into one of the most effective gunners in Coastal Command. But his real contribution wasn't the enemy aircraft he shot down. It was the knowledge he spread, the lives he saved through teaching, the ripples of impact that extended far beyond his own missions and survival. In the end, that was the story. Not of supernatural ability or impossible feats, but of human adaptation, of learning through failure, of the patient transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, generation to generation. It was a story of recognizing that we often are the obstacle to our own success, and that sometimes the breakthrough comes not from acquiring new skills, but from learning to use the ones we already have without interference. The gunner who couldn't hit anything became the teacher who saved hundreds. The desperate adjustment made under threat of reassignment became the foundation of training doctrine that would be used for decades. And the simple insight, "Stop aiming and start seeing," became a principle that extended far beyond the rear turret of a Wellington bomber flying through hostile skies over the Bay of Biscay. Thomas Merrick's war was fought not just with guns and aircraft, but with the more subtle weapons of patience, teaching, and the recognition of human potential. His victories were measured not in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in students who survived, in knowledge preserved and transmitted, in the slow accumulation of small improvements that collectively made an enormous difference. It was in its way as important as any battle, as meaningful as any medal. And it began with a simple question asked by a Scottish gunner on a cold December morning. "What are you looking at when you aim?" The answer to that question changed Thomas Merrick's life, saved the lives of countless others, and left a legacy that outlasted the war itself. In learning to stop interfering with his own natural abilities, in discovering the power of trained instinct over conscious calculation, Thomas had found not just a way to survive, but a way to help others survive. That was his real contribution, his lasting victory, the story worth remembering long after the guns fell silent and the last veterans passed into history.